Because of your initiative and the follow-up of the Dutch Parliament and my staff, we achieved what we have aimed for.
It's a big day, and we did it together. It's a big group effort and a huge monumental milestone, I have to say. I mean, it really is, it's one thing, it's one thing to have one country, but to have 27 countries available to do these sanctions is really a huge, huge thing. So, thank you.
For me, the story started with Dutch Parliament asking me to take this initiative to the European stage, and I confess we first had our doubts about the feasibility, not about the desirability of such an instrument, but we knew the number of EU countries are usually not that enthusiastic about sanctions for whatever reasons. But then I thought, let's give it a try, and I think it was about the same time Mr. Browder visited me in The Hague and urged me to set a step. Then I started a discussion 2 years ago at informal ministerial meeting in Vienna, which is indeed the place to raise subjects that are not necessarily on the agenda. And from then on, my team and I started, of course, first with the countries that we thought would be positive about such a step, which was a large crowd. And together with them, we approached countries that were somewhat more hesitant, and indeed I had a lot of bilateral meetings with colleagues in person, and at the final stage, of course, also on the telephone. A number of European colleagues of mine have been very helpful. A year ago, upon the start of Joseph Borrell as new High Commissioner, during our first Foreign Affairs Council, I asked him explicitly, could you also put it on top of your agenda? And he promised it right away, which was also very helpful. Then Ms. von der Leyen also made it one of her priorities during last year's State of the Union. So then I realized we were nearly there. But now that this morning, indeed, the hammer fell on the conclusion adopted, it was a great achievement, and I think we can be proud of it.
Good.
Mr. Browder.
So, for me, the story begins a lot longer ago. It begins 11 years ago on November 16th, 2009. That was the day that Sergei Magnitsky, my Russian lawyer, was murdered in Russian police custody. He was murdered for uncovering a massive government corruption scheme that he exposed. And I originally tried to get justice in Russia, but I discovered that justice wasn't available, that crimes like this were committed by government officials all the time, and that the system covered up for them. And so I said, if we can't get justice inside of Russia, then we need to get justice outside of Russia. How do we get justice outside of Russia? The people who killed Sergei Magnitsky did it for money, and they keep their money outside of Russia. As easy as it was for them to steal it, and they could be stolen from them. So they'd like to keep their money safe in places like Europe and the United States and Canada and so on. I took this idea to Brussels again, and I kept on going back to Brussels. And I think I've been to Brussels 50 times in this whole exercise. And the European Parliament got on board, and the European Parliament even passed a unanimous resolution in 2014 calling for an EU Magnitsky Act. But the External Action Service at the time wasn't interested in doing it. And we kept on going back to the External Action Service with more resolutions and more pressure from the Parliament, and they kept on saying no, no, no. And they finally said, why don't you just go to the member states and do it at the member state level? And so I started going to the member states, and one of the member states I went to was the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, I found two champions in the Parliament, Sjoerd Sjoerdsma from D66 and Peter Omtzigt from the Christian Democrats. And they took up the cause. And they eventually went to the government, to the Dutch government, and said, we want you to have a domestic Magnitsky Act. And the Dutch government said, we'd rather do it at the EU level. And I thought, okay, well, that sounds like a cop-out, but let's push them on that. And we did. And they passed a resolution calling on the Dutch government to do that. And then the story pretty much follows along the lines of Minister Blok's story about what happened in the EU. But there's one thing missing, which he can't say as a diplomat, but I can say as a private citizen, which is that one of the countries that was blocking it requires unanimity to make this thing happen. One of the countries that was blocking was Hungary. And Hungary has done a lot of blocking in a lot of different places. And we found it an interesting way to try to unblock Hungary, which is that Hungary and Orban in particular were very much craving for support from the U.S. and particularly from Republicans in the U.S. And one of our biggest champions in the U.S. For the U.S. Magnitsky Act is a senator named Roger Wicker, who was among the co-sponsors originally in 2012. And he basically called up the Hungarians and said, if you don't do this, we're going to make an international scandal. And this was in December of last year, actually November, it was in November of last year. And shortly after that, the whole process became unblocked. And so I want to thank Minister Blok for your leadership in doing this. It was a hard road to navigate. You told me when we met that there was all sorts of things that you couldn't tell me about behind the scenes. I learned about them, some of them on my own. But today is a monumental milestone. The bad guys want to go on vacation to Europe, and they won't be able to when they get put on the sanctions list.
So I give the floor to the both present journalists.
Thank you very much for your time. My name is Ruud Mikkers. I work for the Telegraaf, Dutch newspaper. I would like to ask Mr. Browder, how effective will this European version of the law, how effective will it be? Can it be effective amongst 27 member states?
Well, I think that's a really important question. The answer is it depends. This whole business of unanimity is a huge dysfunction in the EU foreign policy system. The fact that a country like Cyprus or Hungary can block the will of a majority of other countries with many, many more people and many, many more issues is a big, big problem. And the fact that Hungary held this thing up for a number of years tells you where this could be. Now, that still remains. And so when the first sanctions lists come out, we could easily see very watered down sanctions lists. And the one thing I'd really like to see is if there is still unanimity, there should be transparency into how these decisions are being made or being blocked, so that public pressure can come to bear on the countries that are doing the blocking. At the moment, it's all a big secret, and I can't think of another legislative comparable where these types of decisions, these important decisions, are being done in secret. The second issue has to do with corruption. The United States Magnitsky Act, Canadian Magnitsky Act, and soon to be the Australian Magnitsky Act all include corruption. It's not included in the EU Magnitsky Act. Sergei Magnitsky's murder was all about him discovering a corruption scandal and then exposing it and getting killed over it. Corruption and human rights abuses go hand in hand.
So is this effectively more than window dressing then, since there is unanimity and all these real life problems we face here?
I don't think so. I think that there will be plenty of people sanctioned, but when it comes to Russia and it comes to China, let's see. But let's not prejudge it. I understand from what I've read in the last few hours that the first sanctions list will come out in early 2021. Let's judge the first sanctions list and see what comes out.
And the whole debate about the name Magnitsky should be involved. I don't see it much coming back in the European proposal, or not at all. How do you view that?
Well, everybody knows there's a Magnitsky Act. All of the politicians refer to it as a Magnitsky Act. There are 7 other countries that call it Magnitsky Act, soon to be an 8th one with Australia. All the headlines today call it a Magnitsky Act, and so I don't even know I can't even remember what the official bureaucratic name is for it. I don't think anyone else can either. So I think for all intents and purposes, it's a Magnitsky Act. Even Ursula von der Leyen refers to it as a Magnitsky Act.
Any questions from Minister Blok? Otherwise we go to David.
You first.
Well, maybe I can ask both of you about, hi, Mr. Browder, it's David Herzenhorn with Politico. And of course, I remember because we talked back when the Magnitsky Act first passed in Washington, and I was in Moscow, and I remember that reaction of Putin, who banned adoptions and was quite enraged by it all. I guess the following up on this question of how will it operate? I mean, now understanding how this has expanded, for both of you to the extent you can answer, who do you envision? I mean, in falling onto this sanctions list right away. I mean, we would expect that given now it reaches beyond Russia, and even if we pull out corruption for a moment, we know of a case in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul where you would expect some very senior members of the Saudi government potentially to be under sanction by the EU, but that doesn't seem politically realistic. And so I wonder if you can address this. Do you have a short list to start of who you're advising? These are clear, clear offenders, because of course the challenge, and it's been true when even the Obama administration had expressed concerns about the Magnitsky Act, that at some point these are countries that believe very strongly, we know the Netherlands does, in rule of law, and yet they have to make a decision to potentially sanction people who have never been brought before a court for a judicial proceeding where they're convicted of a human rights abuse or another.
Well, so first of all, the main reason why we have the Magnitsky Act is for corrupt countries that have corrupt judicial systems that don't bring people before their courts. But let's talk about the low-hanging fruit. The case of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi officials couldn't be a better example of people who should be sanctioned. And the United States, Canada, the UK, I believe Lithuania, have all sanctioned 19 officials from Saudi Arabia connected to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Nobody has sanctioned Mohammed bin Salman, but all the other people involved have been sanctioned. And that's kind of an obvious one. And regardless of politics, I can't imagine that the EU, since this is such a high-profile case, wouldn't sanction those people. And then, of course, there's the origin of the whole law, which is Magnitsky. 7 countries have added the killers of Magnitsky to their sanctions list, to their Magnitsky sanctions list. It would be a travesty of justice if, for some reason, when the first lists come out, that the EU doesn't have Magnitsky's killers on those lists. But the list, the low-hanging fruit goes on and on and on. There are. It's very easy to look at the U.S., Canadian, British lists, and you have the Rohingya genocide, the Burmese generals involved in that have been sanctioned by a number of countries. There's a lot of easy wins here, and I really do hope that the EU acts quickly and acts decisively to sort of get on board and to be harmonized with the rest of the world on this.
That's really interesting. So in a way, it's an advantage of the EU having delayed, in that now you have the roadmap of the other jurisdictions that have already approved a regime like this, to just follow them and match the sanctions that have been brought from other.
That would be the obvious first step, and then the second step is that you can now harmonize. You can have Magnitsky conferences between the United States, Canada, the UK, EU, Australia, and to go after Chinese officials so that nobody can be retaliated against individually. One of the big fears that everybody has is they don't want to express their absolute condemnation of China for setting up the Uyghur concentration camps because everybody's worried about economic retaliation. But if all the sort of decent human rights loving rule of law countries in the world act together, then China can't retaliate economically without cutting off their nose to spite their face.
On everyone. I wonder, Mr. Blok, maybe you could address, is there a way that you see to connect another very important issue in the Netherlands, which is MH17? Are there individuals who have eluded justice in that case that now might come under this umbrella as well? And while I'm at it, we had a hearing just recently in the European Parliament where four Russian opposition activists spoke very loudly about what they would like to see, which is Russian figures connected to Putin that operate quite openly in Europe to face some kind of sanction. Do you see this as a mechanism to do any of those things, starting with MH17 maybe?
Well, I fully understand you're asking in which cases the sanction regime can and will be applied, whether it is regarding MH17 or other cases that we all abhor and have gone unpunished. Well, I already mentioned that behind the scenes, the Netherlands, together with a number of other EU countries, has been preparing a list of names. And I know I'm kind of a spoiler by saying that means it won't be helpful by mentioning who we are thinking of. But I'm afraid in this stage I can only say that I fully appreciate what Mr. Browder also said, that we now should act quickly. That's why we are preparing. But for the reason of getting the result that I want, I cannot mention anyone yet that I would like to try.
And just your thoughts on the question of will there be a sort of rule of law obstacle, this obstacle there of people being sanctioned who haven't yet been convicted, haven't been proven to, what's the
That's of course a basic question behind each and every sanction mechanism. And of course, the preferable way is always bringing someone to an international court, but we all know how difficult that is. And that's why we need this sanction regime. And I heard your questions about will it be effective? There I'm on the positive side, because indeed we saw in Belarus how long it took, but in the end it's very uncomfortable for one or two countries to be the ones that are blocking. Because even if our conversations are private conversations, in the end it will turn out who is blocking what. So I'm confident that we will reach agreement. That first of all, and second, there is no real alternative to an EU-wide sanction mechanism. Because indeed, like Bill Browder already said, it's logical now to team up with countries that already have sanction mechanism. But the alternative of having just a couple of countries with national sanction mechanism, it would still mean that you would only have to transfer your money from, let's say that Netherlands would be such a country with their own sanction mechanism. You could transfer your money from a Dutch bank to German or French bank, and well, you couldn't go shopping in Amsterdam anymore, but you could still go to Rome or Paris. So I realize that decision making is more difficult, but the overall effect will be so much stronger that in the end I'm very glad we reached this agreement, and I'm convinced we will be able to fill the list.
Why did it take so long? I mean, the first bill was passed in the US in 2012. That's 8 years ago. Why took it Europe so long?
Well, I think Bill Browder described the history of reluctance at first with the European Commission and actually also with my government. But when we decided to give it a try, we quickly found out, probably also because of all the developments we saw in the world around us, which convinced a number of countries that were reluctant before that indeed we should have those instruments. For me, it was actually rather quickly. In international politics, if Mr. Browder's involvement has been for a longer period, but I've been involved really for 2 years. And at the start, I would never have dreamt of witnessing the day myself, in my function as a minister, of the sanction mechanism being installed, and having a good chance of also seeing a list of names during my own ministerial period.
And
so,
why?
So allow me to be happy.
Okay. And why isn't corruption a criteria?
Well, indeed, this has been part of the debate, where I side with those that say we should include corruption because corruption is often a reason for human rights violation. There indeed a number of countries thought this one step too far. That's why it's not included as such.
But it can be included next time, or is it just out now?
Well,
and that's
of
it?
course, my ambitions have not disappeared, and then the same goes for the unanimity that is still required. It's well known that the Netherlands is amongst the countries that pleaded over the last couple of years for qualified majority voting for sanction regimes. That's still our position. But now we bless the results that we achieved. There are still aspects to be aimed for.
Yeah. And the QMV is still a desirability in this case. I mean,
Yes,
that's
for,
the next
for
step.
a number of countries that really is a step too far. Maybe a step in between that might be achievable earlier is what we call creative abstention, that you are willing not to block but declare that it is without your support. But even that is still a step too far.
And Mr. Browder, while we have you, can I just ask I don't know if you had a chance to hear the testimony the other day by Alexei Navalny and Karamurza in the European Parliament. But given how tough this has been, what do you think of the chances they have of seeing the EU sanction some prominent Russian oligarchs, some of whom live part of the year quite openly as your neighbors there in the UK? Some of them own stakes in very popular football teams. Do you think there's any prospect of that, or is that a wishful thinking?
Everybody told me it was completely impossible, a total pipe dream, that EU would never have a Magnitsky Act, and here we are today with an EU Magnitsky Act. A lot of people would say it's never going to happen that the EU is going to sanction Russian oligarchs, but everything. I don't think you can make any predictions about it. And the one thing I can say is that the more terrible stuff that Vladimir Putin does, and the more obvious his links are to these wealthy oligarchs, the less likely it is that their defenses and their defenders will be successful in stopping it. When here in the UK, when we tried for many years to get a UK Magnitsky Act, it kept on being blocked and blocked and blocked by every successive government until the week that the Russians poisoned Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury. And all of a sudden, Theresa May couldn't stand in front of the parliament and block it anymore. So those are the types of scenarios that will be created at some point. And so I don't think it's at all an impossibility for what Alexei Navalny was asking for. It's just a question of the circumstances that are created and the moment that the decisions are made.
I have one question for Minister Blok, if I may. Why isn't Magnitsky named in the European Act? Why is it?
A number of countries are worried that the sanction regime might be regarded as targeted specifically against Russia, whereas the strength of the mechanism is that it is against human rights violators everywhere around the world. So that's basically the reason that this instrument is called human rights sanction regime and not Magnitsky regime.
Okay, but for you it is also the Magnitsky Act.
Of course, we all know the history and the involvement of the terrible things that happened to Mr. Magnitsky, which form the ground of the work that we've been doing.
And how is this? You say it's an extra tool you can use, but is it easier than to go for sanction against someone? I mean, you can do it also now, but you need a special regime. I mean, how does that work practically? What does this add in that sense?
Indeed, you need a legal basis for sanctions, and agreeing on a sanction regime is always time-consuming and meets with a number of sensitivities. especially if you have to target a specific country, because then there are always one or two countries with strong economic or historical ties. Now we have a regime that doesn't target any specific countries. It just says, if there are human rights violations, we can apply sanctions. That needs unanimity to put people on the list, but you would need the same unanimity under any specific sanctions regime that we haven't created yet. So we really took a first step, so the first hurdle that makes it much easier to put names on the list.
So it makes it easier. The threshold is lower to go after people or entities.
Yes, that's all.
And Mr. Browder, if I may ask you one more question. What is the next step for you? This is obviously a success for you in Europe. What would be the next step now?
Well, we also had some great news over the weekend in Australia, that the Australian Parliament, after a year-long public inquiry on a unanimous basis, has put together a formal recommendation to the government for passing an Australian Magnitsky Act. And so we hope to have another milestone in Australia when the legislative agenda gets going in the new year. The obvious next step after that would be New Zealand, there's South Africa, and then of course across the world, the next step is for all the countries that have Magnitsky Acts to apply the sanctions liberally, so that it becomes sort of an expectation, not just an unusual event. For if someone does a terrible human rights atrocity, it should be their expectation that they're going to be sanctioned across the world by all the countries that have Magnitsky Acts. And we need to see greater use of the Magnitsky Act in all countries that have it, so that it becomes a sort of regular process. It's not an unusual thing, and everyone should expect bad things to happen to them if they do torturing, killing, genocide, etc.
And apart from the EU, how many countries do have a Magnitsky Act right now? The US, Canada, the UK?
There are 7 countries: the US, Canada, the UK, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Kosovo. Of course, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the EU. So we will have, if you exclude Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with their own Magnitsky Acts, you have 27 plus 4, so 31 countries. As of today, there are 31 countries that have a Magnitsky Act. And that's a pretty powerful tool if used together and if used regularly against people who do these atrocities.
Thank you.
Mr. Browder, can I ask you just to clear up one detail that every time, I hate it that every time I write about Magnitsky Act, I get some number of messages saying, but he wasn't a lawyer. He was the forensic accountant on the legal team. You know, obviously the horrible things that happened to him are indisputable, but what's the right way? Is it the right way to call him a lawyer or a member of the legal team? Is that the more precise?
So Sergei Magnitsky was a licensed auditor. As a licensed auditor, he was allowed to practice law in tax courts, and so he could defend his clients in tax courts. And so he was our lawyer in tax disputes and so on. And so I think probably for the purpose of publication, you can say he's a tax advisor. But he was, and I can point to 50 different examples when he represented clients in court, and that's why I called him my lawyer, because up until recently, I never even thought that he was anything other than a lawyer. Let me just say a quick word to Minister Blok. I just want to thank you for your persistence and effort, and I know it's like herding cats to try to work with 26 other countries in making this happen. And I'm very grateful for what you've done and how you've changed the world today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for your kind words, but it's all thanks to your perseverance.